They thought I was the quiet one, the weak one, the loser who sat behind a laptop every day chasing some fantasy of making it online. Even my girlfriend Rachel, who had stood beside me for 5 years, stopped believing somewhere along the way. I could see it in her eyes. The way she stopped asking about my work, the way she started spending more nights out with friends and fewer nights beside me. It didn't hit me all at once. It came in pieces, little signs, small changes, and then finally the night it all collapsed. I came home early from a trip I never told her I was cutting short. I walked into our apartment and something felt off. The lights were on low. Someone's shoes were by the door, not mine, not hers, someone else's. The same cheap cologne I recognized from my old friend Derek mixed with Rachel's vanilla perfume, and my heart knew before my brain caught up. I didn't rush, I didn't scream, I didn't even feel angry, just a cold, steady silence like a storm building behind glass. I walked slowly to the bedroom door and heard them laughing, low voices, soft giggles, the sound of betrayal, but I kept calm because I had something they didn't know. I had built something over the last 3 years while they were out drinking and living the Instagram life. I had worked behind the scenes, created systems, sold software, negotiated licensing deals, and by this point I was pulling in over $500,000 a year, and they had no clue. They still thought I was a broke freelancer living paycheck to paycheck. I opened the bedroom door slowly and saw them together, covers barely pulled over themselves. They froze for a second, but not with guilt, with annoyance, like I was the one interrupting them. Rachel looked up and said flatly, "You weren't supposed to be home until tomorrow." Derek smirked and didn't even bother covering himself. "Dude, it's not what you think," he said, trying to sound casual, but I just stared at them and said, "It's exactly what I think." Rachel shrugged and looked me straight in the eyes. "Ben, let's not do this," she said. "Don't make this dramatic. You were never going to be enough for me." I turned to Derek and said, "And you?" He laughed and said, "Bro, you're a good guy, but come on, you spend all day behind a computer chasing a pipe dream. You were never really competition." I nodded slowly and smiled. "Right," I said, "enjoy yourselves." I turned and walked out without saying anything else. No yelling, no slamming doors. I just walked down to the garage, got in my Tesla, the one they didn't know about because I kept it parked at my office, and drove to the downtown penthouse I had rented for the weekend, not because I needed it, but because I could. They thought they were trading up. What they didn't know was that I had already won. The first thing I did after leaving wasn't cry or drink or call anyone. It was check my Stripe dashboard. $512,000 in revenue year to date. My margins clean. My systems automated. 5 clients on monthly retainers. 2 licensing deals. 3 white-labeled apps running passively. I had built everything in silence because noise invites jealousy and noise makes people pay attention, and I didn't want attention. Not then. I wanted freedom. I wanted to know that if I ever had to walk away from something or someone, I could do it with my head high and my bank account smiling, and that night proved it. I drove through the city, calm, focused, thinking about how long I had allowed myself to believe I was the problem. Maybe I wasn't exciting enough. Maybe I wasn't flashy enough. Maybe I wasn't enough, period. But the truth was I was just surrounded by people who couldn't see value unless it was dripping in designer labels or shouted from rooftops. I had played the role of the underdog for so long I almost believed it myself, but not anymore. I pulled into the parking garage of the high-rise. The valet nodded, recognizing me from last weekend. I stepped into the elevator, scanned the key card for the penthouse, and took a deep breath as the doors closed. The silence was different now, heavier but cleaner, the kind of silence that feels like space, like clarity, not loneliness. I opened the door and stepped into the 2-story suite, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights. A bottle of champagne still cold in the fridge from the last time I stayed here alone. I sat on the balcony, opened my laptop, and got to work, because that's what I do when everything goes wrong. I build. When people cheat, I code. When they lie, I write new systems. When they walk out, I level up. And as I sat there thinking back to Rachel and Derek tangled in my bed, I realized something funny. They didn't even ask for forgiveness. They didn't panic. They didn't beg. They genuinely thought they were upgrading. That's the part that stuck with me, not the betrayal, but the assumption that I was nothing, that I was disposable, that I'd go cry into a pillow while they posted beach photos with captions like "good vibes only." It was almost amusing because I had quietly invested in Derek's company a year ago through a shelf firm, and I knew something he didn't know yet. His burn rate was higher than he realized. His runway was 3 months max. I had the power to pull funding and watch his whole little dream collapse. And the best part was I didn't even need revenge. I just needed patience, because life had a funny way of bringing things full circle, and something told me they were going to come back around sooner than they thought. 2 weeks passed without a word from either of them. I didn't block their numbers. I didn't post anything online. I just vanished from their lives like I never existed, which honestly hurt more than screaming would have, because silence makes people uneasy, and eventually they started to feel it. First, it was a missed call from Rachel at midnight. I ignored it. Then 3 messages. "Hey, can we talk? It's important." Then a longer one. "Ben, I know you're hurt. I never meant to hurt you. Can we just meet and talk?" Please, I didn't answer, not because I was bitter, but because there was nothing left to say. She made her choice, and I had made mine. I wasn't going to play the role of the emotionally broken ex while she figured out if the grass was greener. I had businesses to run, contracts to review, systems to scale. Pain is fuel if you know how to use it, and I had learned to turn mine into momentum. The next day, I got a call from Derek, unknown number. I picked up out of curiosity. Bro, hey, listen, man, I know things got weird, he said, like he hadn't just burned a 20-year friendship over a 5-second thrill. I stayed silent for a moment. He kept talking. We've hit some turbulence with the app. The investors are nervous, and I heard you had experience with B2B solutions. Think we could meet and talk some strategy? One almost laughed right there. The same guy who said I wasn't competition was now calling me for help with a sinking ship. I said, sure, let's meet tomorrow noon. My office, 3rd floor of the Brick Line Tower downtown. Bring your pitch deck. I hung up before he could respond and sat there for a full minute letting it sink in. He didn't know I was one of his own investors. He didn't know I had access to all his burn reports, his projections, his shady little expenses, and he definitely didn't know I had already decided to pull out 2 weeks ago, not out of revenge, just out of logic. His numbers didn't make sense, and now he was coming to me like a dog who bit the hand that fed him, begging for another. But I spent the night polishing my reports, tightening some back-end structures, and reviewing a few new client offers. I had no time to waste on people who wasted me. The next day, I dressed sharp, walked into my office suite that overlooked the city, and waited. When Derek walked in and saw me sitting at the head of the conference table, something shifted in his face, a flicker of surprise or maybe confusion. He didn't expect this version of me, the one in tailored clothes and a glass-walled office, the one who wasn't laughing or playing humble, the one who looked like money. I stood, shook his hand, and said, let's talk, tell me everything. And as he opened his laptop and started his pitch, I already knew how it would end, because this time I held all the cards. Derek launched into his pitch like he was still talking to the old version of me, full of buzzwords and confidence, trying to sell me on a vision I already knew was falling apart. He talked about growth projections, partnership, scalability, but the numbers were soft. And I knew it. He didn't realize I had already seen his financials weeks ago when I quietly withdrew funding through my holding company. He had no idea I'd been watching the decline before it even showed up in the dashboard. I let him talk for a full 10 minutes, nodding slowly, pretending to take notes while I sipped my coffee and stared through him. When he finally finished, he leaned back and said, what do you think, man? Can we work something out? I waited just long enough to make the silence uncomfortable. Then I said, Derek, tell me the truth. How long have you been burning over $50K a month? He blinked. What? How do you know that? I smiled. Doesn't matter. Just answer the question. He looked down, rubbed the back of his neck. 4 months. Maybe 5. I leaned forward and said, so you knew this was coming, and you still spent 10 grand last month on influencer marketing and 2,000 on a team dinner. He froze. How the hell do you know all this? I sat back and said, you ever heard of Ventrix Holdings? He paused. The name clearly familiar. Yeah, they were one of our early-stage backers. Why? I said. I own it. His face changed completely. The confidence drained out of him like air from a balloon. You're lying. No, I said. I bought out my partners half last year. I've had access to everything since, and 2 weeks ago, I pulled the plug because your burn rate's unsustainable, your product is unscalable, and you've got 3 months left at best. He was silent. I continued, but I'll make you an offer. I'll buy out the IP and the back-end code. I'll let you walk away clean, but I own everything. You get nothing, and you sign a non-compete for 3 years. His mouth opened, then closed. I could see his brain scrambling. This wasn't just a power move. It was a full takeover, and he knew it. I stood up, straightened my cuffs, and said, or don't take the deal, and in 3 months your servers shut down, your devs quit, and your brand evaporates. Either way, when I walked to the door, opened it, and said, let me know by the end of the day. Derek walked out like a ghost, the man who stole my girlfriend, now realizing he had nothing and I had everything. And as the door clicked shut, I felt nothing, no anger, no joy, just clarity. This wasn't revenge, it was the natural order of things. When you build in silence, you don't need to scream. When you arrive, the results speak louder than betrayal ever could. Derek didn't call that night, but Rachel did. Her name lit up my phone 5 times in a row. Then came the messages. Ben, please, I just found out what you've been doing. I'm so sorry. I was stupid. I didn't know how hard you were working. Please, can we talk? Just once, please. I stared at the screen, feeling nothing, not even satisfaction. Her timing was perfect, of course, like they always are, when people realize they traded gold for glitter, but I didn't answer. I just locked my phone and went back to reviewing a proposal from a European client offering me a 6-figure licensing deal for one of my smaller products. I was already moving forward while she was trying to look back. The next day around noon, a knock came at my office door. It was her, standing in a white blouse and jeans, hair tied back, eyes glassy. She looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I just felt bigger. She said quietly, I heard what happened with Derek. He told me about your company, your office, this place. She looked around like she couldn't believe I had built all this and never told her. I let the silence hang until she finally Said, I made a mistake, Ben. I thought you were never going to make it. I thought you were stuck. I was wrong. I see that now. I stood across the room from her and said, do you remember that night we fought about me skipping your friend's birthday dinner? She nodded. I said, you called me a selfish dreamer. You said I'd never be stable enough for real life. She looked down. I continued, that was the night I closed my second licensing deal. I skipped dinner to make the call that made me $120,000, and you mocked me for it. She was crying now, barely holding it in, and I didn't stop, because I needed her to hear it. You thought I was wasting time. When I was buying freedom, you thought I was avoiding life. When I was designing mine, you didn't leave me for someone better, Rachel. You left me for someone louder, and now you're here, because the truth finally spoke louder than the lies. She walked closer. Please, Ben, I'll do anything. Just let me make this right. We can start over. I'll support everything you're doing. I've changed. I paused, then said, you know what's crazy? I once would have done anything to hear you say that. But now I don't even believe you mean it. You're not sorry. Because you hurt me. You're sorry. Because it didn't work out with him, and I wasn't the failure you hoped I'd be. She tried to speak, but I shook my head and said, I forgive you, but I don't need you anymore. Goodbye. Rachel and I walked past her toward the conference room where my next meeting was waiting. Her voice cracked behind me. Ben, please don't do this. But I didn't turn around, because this time I was walking towards something, not away from it, and that made all the difference. After Rachel left, I stood by the window of my office and watched her walk out of the building slowly, like she was hoping I'd come after her. But I didn't, because I was done chasing people who only show up when it's convenient. I had meetings to run, deals to sign, a life to build, and I wasn't about to slow down now, not when everything I worked for was finally unfolding the way I always imagined it would. The next few weeks moved fast. I finalized the acquisition of Derek's app after he reluctantly agreed to my offer. I gave him a clean exit with just enough dignity to walk away, without dragging my name through the mud, though I could tell it burned him that the guy he called a nobody now owned everything he built. I hired a small dev team to restructure the code, plugged it into one of my existing frameworks, and turned it into a subscription model. Within 30 days, it was bringing in revenue, real revenue, not investor play money. I started getting messages from old classmates, old coworkers, even some of Rachel's friends, all of them suddenly remembering how much they believed in me, how much potential they always said I had. It was funny watching the shift. People who once laughed at me for driving a beat-up Honda and wearing the same 3 hoodies now asking if I could look over their startup pitch or introduce them to investors or give them advice on passive income. But I didn't feel bitter. I felt free, because I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. The world had already answered the question I spent years trying to solve. Am I enough? Yes, more than enough. One night, I sat on the balcony of the penthouse again, glass of scotch in hand, and thought about everything: the betrayal, the silence, the slow grind, the moments I almost gave up. All of it led here, not to revenge, not to applause, but to peace. I could finally breathe, without feeling like I had to explain myself to anyone, and that was worth more than any money in the world. But deep down, I knew the story wasn't quite over. Not yet, because people like Derek and Rachel don't just vanish, they circle back, not for love or closure, but for survival. And sure enough, it happened on a quiet Sunday morning when I got a notification on LinkedIn, a connection request from Rachel followed by a message. Hey, I know this might be weird, but would you ever be open to grabbing coffee sometime? Just to talk, no pressure. I stared at it for a while, not angry, not amused, just curious about how far someone will go when they realize the life they mocked turned out to be the one they wanted. I didn't respond to Rachel's message right away. I let it sit there unread, even though I had obviously seen it, because sometimes silence says more than any sentence ever could. But part of me wanted to know what she would do next, not because I missed her or needed anything from her, but because I was curious how far she would go to get back into a life she once threw away. It took 3 days before she tried again, this time a longer message. I know I hurt you more than I probably even realize, and I'm not asking to fix anything. I just really want to see you one last time and say everything I should have said back then. You don't owe me that. I just hope maybe you'll consider it. I stared at the words and felt nothing, not anger, not hope, just the detached clarity that comes after you've outgrown someone completely. I wasn't that man she left anymore, and she wasn't the girl I once waited on every night while she scrolled through other people's perfect lives and wondered why ours didn't feel like theirs. But maybe I did want closure, not for her, for me. So I replied one word: coffee. She suggested a place downtown. I picked a different one, quieter, no crowds. I didn't want this to be a show. She walked in wearing a soft blue dress, the kind she used to wear on our early dates when we still believed in things like forever. She smiled nervously. I didn't smile back. We sat across from each other, her hands fidgeting with the cup. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me, and maybe she didn't. Because I had changed in ways she never imagined. I had grown into myself. She started talking almost immediately, apologizing, explaining, crying a little, then catching herself. She told me how things with Derek fell apart, how he got jealous of her career, how he wasn't who she thought he was. I didn't say a word. She kept going, saying she missed me, saying she knew she didn't deserve a second chance, but if I ever wanted one, she'd be there. I waited until she was done, then asked why now. She blinked and said, because you became everything I always hoped you'd be, and I realized. I walked away right before the best part, and there it was, the truth, not love, not regret, just timing. She didn't want me back because of who I was. She wanted me back because of where I was. I nodded, finished my coffee, and said, Rachel, I'm glad you came, but we're not the same people anymore. You fell in love with the man I used to be, and I fell in love with the woman you pretended to be. We both outgrew the lie. She opened her mouth, but I stood up and added, take care of yourself. And I left her sitting there, cup half full, tears in her eyes, and the sound of a door closing forever echoing between us. After that coffee meeting with Rachel, I felt something strange, not sadness, not pride, just relief, like a door had been shut, not slammed, not locked, just gently pushed closed with no need to open it again. I walked out of that cafe and never looked back because I had nothing left to prove to her or to anyone else. Everything I was building was no longer fueled by pain. It was powered by purpose. I spent the next few months scaling my systems, automating my onboarding, creating a second stream of income through digital assets, and by the end of the quarter, my revenue crossed $600,000 annually, and the craziest part was how quiet it all still was. No flashy cars, no viral success stories, just quiet, consistent execution, the kind of wealth that doesn't scream because it doesn't need to. I started mentoring a few young developers, guys who reminded me of myself back when I was broke and building from my bedroom. I taught them what I wish someone had taught me: how to build value, how to stay patient, how to grow without needing validation from people who wouldn't clap for you anyway. And somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking about Rachel and Derek, not because I hated them, but because they simply stopped matching. They were just a chapter in a book I had already finished. One night, I got a message from an unknown number. It was Derek, short and pathetic. Hey man, I know you probably hate me, but I'm in a tough spot and could use some advice. I didn't respond because I had already given him everything he ever needed to succeed, and he threw it away for the illusion of winning. The truth was they both thought I was losing. Back then, Rachel thought she was upgrading. Derek thought he was taking what was mine, and neither of them saw that I was never competing with them in the first place. I was building while they were performing. I was investing while they were spending. I was growing while they were posing. I didn't need to clap back or get revenge, because real revenge isn't loud. It's living better while they fade quietly into the background, forgotten and irrelevant. But here's the thing about success: when it finally arrives, people either admire it or try to find their way back into it. And I wasn't letting anyone back in who couldn't clap when I was invisible and broke. One morning, I woke up, checked my email, and saw an invitation to speak at a private tech event hosted by one of the biggest startup incubators in the country. And the craziest part was the list of attendees included some of the very people who used to laugh at me. I stared at the screen for a second, then smiled, not because I was finally being seen, but because I didn't need their validation anymore. I already knew who I was and what I was worth, and this time when I walked into the room, it wouldn't be as the quiet one or the underdog or the guy who got cheated on. It would be as the man who turned betrayal into an empire. The night of the tech event came faster than I expected. I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my collar, looking at the reflection of a man I barely recognized, not because I looked different, but because I felt different, calm, focused, completely in control. I arrived early, walked through the glass doors of the private venue, and nodded at the receptionist who handed me my speaker badge, as if it were just another formality. A few years ago, I couldn't even get into these events. Now I was the keynote. I walked past open bars and networking circles, people dressed in expensive suits tossing around words like equity and scalability, but none of it impressed me anymore, not like it used to, because I knew that half the room was bluffing, just like Derek used to. All flash, no foundation. I made my way to the green room, went over my notes, and waited for my cue. When they finally called my name, I stepped onto the stage to a quiet, respectful applause and started speaking. I didn't talk about revenge. I didn't name names. I just told the truth. I told them how I built something out of nothing, how I spent years being ignored, underestimated, even mocked, and how that silence became the foundation of my discipline. I told them that success wasn't about proving people wrong. It was about proving yourself right, even when no one believed in the path you were on. And I ended with a single line that came from somewhere deep inside me: the same people who laughed at you in private will try to praise you in public once they see you win, but by then you won't need their applause because the victory is already yours. When I walked off the stage, the applause was louder, longer, but I didn't stay for the networking or the interviews. I left through the side exit, walked into the cool night air, and just stood there for a moment, breathing in everything I had become. That's when I saw her, Rachel, standing by the edge of the parking lot, arms crossed, eyes wide, like she hadn't expected to see me leave early or Maybe like she didn't expect to feel so small in front of the version of me she never believed I could become. She walked up slowly like someone approaching a stranger and said softly, "You were amazing in there. I heard your whole talk. I didn't invite her. I didn't ask." How she found out, maybe she was a guest of someone, or maybe she found a way to sneak in. Either way, I didn't care. I just looked at her and said thanks. She stood there waiting for something, waiting for a door to open, but I didn't give her one because I finally realized she wasn't part of this chapter. She was part of the reason it exists, but not the story itself. And when she whispered, "I still think about us," I just smiled and said, "There is no us," and walked past her into the dark, quiet freedom of the life I had built alone. The morning after the event, I woke up to dozens of new emails, new opportunities, interviews, partnerships, people wanting to collaborate, wanting to invest, wanting to be part of something they had once ignored. And I didn't feel proud. I felt grounded because I knew exactly how I got here, not through luck or favors, but through years of being overlooked, underestimated, and left behind. People like Rachel and Derek were just symbols of a larger truth that most of the world only sees what's obvious. They don't believe in you until you no longer need them to. And by then it's too late. I checked my calendar and saw the next month was fully booked with new launches, travel, speaking engagements, and strategy calls, but I blocked out one full weekend just for myself. No work, no emails, just peace. I drove 3 hours to a quiet cabin by the lake, the kind of place with no Wi-Fi, no distractions, just trees, water, and silence. The first night I sat by the fire thinking about the beginning, the basement where I started, the cheap coffee, the doubt, the fights with Rachel, the betrayal, the loneliness, all of it. And I felt something close to gratitude, not for the pain itself, but for what it gave me. It made me disciplined. It made me ruthless in my focus. It made me immune to noise. And I realized something that I had never admitted out loud until now. They didn't break me. They built me. Every lie, every insult, every moment I felt small just pushed me closer to the man I am now. Not a millionaire, not a success story. Just someone who kept showing up when no one else did, someone who didn't fold when it got hard, who didn't quit when it got lonely. And somewhere in that silence by the fire, I let go of the past, not because it didn't matter, but because it already served its purpose, and it was time to move forward. The next morning, I stood at the edge of the lake watching the sunrise. No phone, no camera, no audience, just me in the stillness. And in that moment, I finally understood that winning wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about becoming someone who no longer needed to. Winning was knowing I could lose everything today and still rebuild again, twice as fast, twice as strong, because this time I wasn't building from pain, I was building from peace, and that's something no one can take from me, not Rachel, not Derek, not anyone. And as I walked back to the cabin, I smiled because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't chasing anything. I had already arrived.